This story is a work of historical Gothic fiction. Though it draws inspiration from Victorian convent life, religious imagery, and folklore, it is not based on real events or actual persons. The tale blends elements of horror, superstition, and the supernatural purely for entertainment purposes. It should not be interpreted as an accurate representation of religious institutions, practices, or history. All characters, places, and rituals depicted are fictional. The next morning began with the tolling of bells. Catherine woke to the sound, sharp and hollow, echoing through the dormitory. The other novices rose immediately, their movements precise, as if choreographed. Catherine scrambled to follow, still adjusting to the rhythm of this new life. They filed in silence to the chapel for morning prayers. Catherine noticed how none of the girls exchanged greetings, not even the faintest nod of acknowledgement. Their faces were blank, their footsteps muted against the stone. Only the bells spoke. The Mother Superior stood waiting at the altar. Her pale eyes swept across the group, and Catherine swore for a moment they stopped on her longer than the rest. The service began with chanting, low and resonant, the sound vibrating through Catherine's chest. She joined in, though clumsily, her tongue tripping over unfamiliar words. She felt heat rise to her cheeks as the girl beside her shot a quick glance, sharp with warning. When prayers ended, they returned to the dormitory. Only then did Catherine notice the parchment nailed to the wall beside the door. Its ink was bold, its words stern. "Silence is our vow. Silence is our strength. Break it, and you betray not only this convent, but God Himself." Below the proclamation, 7 rules were listed. Novices shall not speak without permission. Novices shall not whisper, sing, or laugh outside of prayer. Novices shall not question the instructions of their elders. Novices shall confess any breach of silence immediately. Novices shall not form attachments of friendship. Novices shall remember that silence is obedience, and obedience is holiness. Silence broken 3 times condemns the soul to exile. The word exile was scratched deeper into the parchment, as if it had been carved rather than written. Catherine stared at the rules, a cold weight settling in her stomach. This was not the discipline of prayer she had been taught at home. This was something else, something designed not to elevate the spirit but to crush it. As the day unfolded, she witnessed how the rules governed every breath of life at St. Mary's. The novices worked in the kitchens, scrubbed the floors, tended the gardens, all in silence. Even the smallest sound, a sigh or a cough, seemed to draw suspicious glances. When one girl dropped a pail, the clang rang out like a gunshot. Every head turned. The girl flushed scarlet, and before the hour was out, she had been summoned to the Mother Superior's office. She did not return until evening, her eyes swollen from tears. She said nothing, but Catherine saw the marks of fear etched on her face. At mealtime, the silence was suffocating. Dozens of girls ate together in the refectory, yet the only sounds were the scrape of spoons against bowls and the shuffle of feet. At home, meals had been filled with laughter and chatter. Here, even the act of chewing felt like a crime. It was Isabel who dared to break the silence, her lips moving just enough for Catherine to catch the words. "Don't chew too loudly. They'll notice." Catherine's eyes widened. To whisper was forbidden, yet Isabel risked it, her expression as calm as if she had said nothing at all. Catherine understood then that Isabel was different, not reckless exactly, but unwilling to surrender entirely. Later that day, Catherine encountered her first true punishment. A novice named Eliza, small, timid, perhaps no older than 14, dropped her rosary during evening prayers. The beads clattered across the stone floor. Gasps rippled, quickly stifled. The Mother Superior halted the chant. The silence that followed was more terrifying than anger. Slowly, she descended from the altar and lifted the rosary. She placed it back into Eliza's trembling hands, then whispered something Catherine could not hear. Eliza was led away by 2 senior nuns. Hours later she returned. Her lips were pale, as though blood had been drawn from them. She clutched her rosary with shaking hands, and when she opened her mouth to pray, no sound came out. It was as if her voice had been taken from her. Catherine's skin crawled. She wanted to ask what had happened, but the weight of the rules pressed her tongue still. Only later, in the dormitory, did Margaret whisper the truth. They sewed her lips. She breathed, eyes darting nervously. With thread. Just for a day. To remind her. Catherine's stomach turned. The convent's silence was not voluntary. It was forced, enforced with cruelty. That night she could not sleep. She lay awake, her mind racing, her chest tight with fear. Every time she thought she heard a sound, the creak of wood, the whisper of footsteps, she sat upright, straining to listen. But there was nothing. Nothing except the silence. The next morning, as she walked the cloisters, Catherine noticed something carved into the stone of one pillar. The etching was faint, worn down by time, but she could just make it out. Speak and be lost. The words chilled her. Were they a warning? A threat? Or a desperate message left by one of the vanished? Isabel appeared at her side, her smile thin and knowing. You've read it, haven't you? Catherine nodded. They tell us silence is holy. Isabel whispered, so low Catherine barely heard. But it's not holiness they want. It's obedience. They feed on it. Before Catherine could respond, footsteps echoed down the hall. Isabel fell silent, her expression shifting into the same mask of blank devotion as the others. The nun who passed them gave no sign of suspicion. Yet Catherine felt the hairs rise on her arms. She realized then that Isabel was right. Silence here was not prayer, it was power. It was the way the convent controlled every soul within its walls. And Catherine feared she would not be strong enough to resist it forever. That night, the bells tolled again. Once. Twice. 3 times. Margaret sat bolt upright in bed, her face pale as wax. She clutched Catherine's arm. Do not follow, she whispered. When the 3rd bell rings, they go to the chapel. You must never follow. Catherine's heart pounded. She wanted to ask who they were, but Margaret shook her head violently, her lips pressed tight. In the silence that followed, Catherine listened to the shuffle of feet in the corridor, the faint glow of candles slipping beneath the dormitory door. And she knew, whatever waited in the chapel after the 3rd bell, it was the heart of the convent's secret. The warning of the 3rd bell haunted Catherine for days. Each time it tolled in the dead of night, she lay stiff beneath her thin blanket, her breast shallow, her mind alive with questions. Who walked those halls after dark? Why were novices forbidden to follow? And what awaited in the chapel when shadows stretched long? One evening, unable to quell her curiosity, Catherine rose quietly after the bells. She moved silently across the dormitory, careful not to wake Margaret, who had become almost protective since the night of the warning. Catherine slipped into the corridor, the stones cold beneath her bare feet. The air was heavy with candle smoke. Shadows leapt along the walls as a procession of nuns passed ahead, their faces hidden beneath black veils, their hands carrying books bound in leather so dark it seemed to drink in the light. Catherine pressed herself against the wall, heart hammering, and dared not breathe until they were gone. When she followed at a distance, she noticed something she had not before. The procession did not enter the chapel. Instead, they turned down a side passage Catherine had thought to be sealed. The heavy door at the end groaned open, revealing a stairwell spiraling into the earth. The nuns disappeared below. The door closed. The silence returned. Catherine waited until the sound of footsteps faded, then approached. She pressed her hand against the iron latch. It was warm, as if touched by fire. She recoiled instinctively but forced herself to look closer. A carving ran across the wood, Latin words etched deep into the grain. Quod mortuum est tacit. What is dead must remain silent. Her throat tightened. She reached for the latch again, but a hand shot out from the shadows and gripped her wrist. Don't, Isabel hissed, pulling her back. That door is not for us. Catherine turned, startled. Isabel's face was pale in the torchlight, her eyes sharp with warning. You've seen them, haven't you? Catherine whispered. Yes, Isabel said. And I've seen what happens to those who follow. What happens? For a moment, Isabel said nothing. Then she leaned close, her breath trembling. They vanish. And days later, a new photograph appears on the wall. Catherine's blood ran cold. She thought of the parlor lined with frames, each one holding a girl whose gaze seemed trapped between worlds. Could the forbidden chamber be where they disappeared? Isabel released her wrist. If you value your life, forget what you've seen. But Catherine could not forget. The door haunted her dreams. She would wake in the night, her ears filled with the sound of whispers, though she could not tell if they were real or imagined. The chance to learn more came unexpectedly. A week later, Catherine was assigned to help Sister Agnes polish the brass in the east corridor. As they worked, Catherine noticed that one of the walls bore faint scorch marks, as though fire had licked across it long ago. She asked cautiously, "What happened here, Sister?" Sister Agnes stiffened. For a long moment, she did not reply. Then, in a voice so low it was almost a breath, she said, "The fire began near the chamber. The walls remember." Before Catherine could ask more, footsteps echoed behind them. Mother Superior appeared, her pale eyes colder than ever. She looked at Catherine, then at Sister Agnes, and for one chilling second Catherine thought she might strike them both down for speaking. Instead, the Mother Superior smiled. "Be vigilant, sister. Silence is fragile." When she was gone, Sister Agnes would say no more. That night, Catherine resolved to see the chamber for herself. The bells tolled thrice, their sound reverberating through the stone. Once more she slipped from her bed. Isabel's cot was empty. Margaret stirred, her lips parting as though to stop her, but no words came. Catherine padded through the corridors, her pulse racing. The door loomed at the end of the passage, darker than the shadows around it. She touched the latch. This time, it was cold, unnaturally so. She pushed. The door groaned open. A narrow stair spiraled downward, the walls slick with damp. The air smelled of earth, candle wax, and something metallic, like rust or blood. Catherine descended, one hand grazing the wall for balance. The silence was oppressive, so thick it seemed to hum against her ears. At the bottom, she entered a long corridor lined with alcoves. Candles flickered within them, their flames weak and trembling. In each alcove hung a frame, identical to those in the parlor above. But these frames were not filled with photographs. They held masks. Each mask was pale, human-like, with painted eyes staring forward. Some were cracked, some stained. Catherine realized with horror that they were cast from faces. The features were too precise, the lips too defined. These were death masks. Her stomach twisted, bow rising in her throat. She turned, meaning to flee, but movement caught her eye at the end of the hall. A door stood slightly ajar. Beyond it came the faint glow of red light. Compelled by a force she could not name, Catherine stepped forward. The air grew hotter, thicker, as if the walls themselves were alive. She reached the door and peered inside. What she saw froze her where she stood. The chamber was circular, its walls lined with yet more frames. But these did not hold masks or photographs. They held bodies. 7 novices hung suspended against the walls, their heads bowed, their hands folded in mock prayer. Thin threads stitched their lips shut, the black thread glistening in the candlelight. Their eyes were painted wide open, unblinking, eternal. Catherine stifled a scream with her hands. Her legs trembled, nearly giving way. And then, one of the painted eyes moved. It rolled toward her, locking her gaze. A tear slipped down the girl's cheek, staining the paint. Catherine stumbled backward, her mind reeling. These were not corpses. They were alive. Alive, and bound into living death. She turned to flee, but the sound of footsteps echoed behind her. The Mother Superior stood at the threshold, her shadow stretching long across the chamber floor. Her voice was soft, but it carried like thunder. "You should not be here." Catherine's heart stopped as the Mother Superior's figure filled the chamber doorway. The air felt colder, heavier, as if the very stones of the convent leaned inward to trap her. "You should not be here," the Mother Superior repeated, her tone calm but brimming with menace. Her pale eyes lingered on Catherine's trembling frame. For a heartbeat, Catherine thought she would be struck down then and there, condemned to hang alongside the others. But instead, the Mother Superior smiled, a thin, terrible smile. "Curiosity is dangerous, child," she said. "But it can be corrected." 2 senior nuns appeared behind her, their faces hidden beneath their veils. They stepped forward, seizing Catherine by the arms. She struggled, but their grips were iron. The Mother Superior gestured toward the stair. "Bring her." Catherine was dragged from the chamber, her vision blurring with panic. She thought she would be taken back to the dormitory or worse, to join the stitch-lipped victims in silence forever. But instead, they led her to a narrow room she had never seen before, one lined with shelves of ancient books and scrolls. A single candle burned on a table at the center, illuminating a massive, leather-bound tome. The Mother Superior closed the door behind them. The lock clicked into place. "This," she said, moving to the table, "is where obedience is recorded. Every novice. Every vow. Every transgression." She placed her hand on the book. Catherine's breath caught. The leather cover was cracked and worn, but the surface bore faint impressions, as though hands had clawed at it over centuries. A bronze clasp kept it shut, engraved with a single symbol, a cross pierced by a needle and thread. The Mother Superior undid the clasp and opened the book. Catherine glimpsed rows of names written in precise, elegant script. Some names were crossed out with thick black lines, others marked with strange symbols she did not recognize. Alongside each entry was a date, the day the novice entered, and another date beside it. Most of those second dates ended the same way. The day of disappearance. Catherine scanned the pages. Dozens, no, hundreds of names filled the ledger. The earliest dated back centuries. Each told the same story, a girl's arrival, her brief service, and then her silence. Some had not lasted a year. Others survived longer, but few reached more than 3 before their names were struck through. Her stomach twisted when she saw Eliza's name written near the bottom, the timid girl whose lips had been sewn. The date beside her entry was today's. Catherine's throat tightened. Eliza was already marked as gone. The Mother Superior watched her carefully. "You see, Catherine, obedience must be preserved. The ledger is our covenant. It ensures that silence remains unbroken." Catherine forced her voice to steady. "And those, in the chamber?" The Mother Superior's smile deepened. "They are examples. Warnings. Living proof of what silence demands." She turned the page slowly, revealing a section filled with red ink. Unlike the others, these entries included not just names, but descriptions, hair color, eye color, distinguishing marks. Catherine's chest constricted as she realized these were detailed records, cataloging each girl like livestock. Her eyes caught on one entry that froze her blood. Isabel Marlowe, black hair, gray eyes. Entered 1846. Silence date, 1848. Catherine's breath faltered. Isabel, her only friend, had entered the convent nearly a century ago. And yet she still walked the halls, still whispered warnings, still lived. Or did she? Her mind reeled. Was Isabel a ghost, tethered here by whatever power bound the convent? Or something worse, one of the living dead, kept alive by unnatural means? The Mother Superior snapped the book shut. "Curiosity is not a sin if it leads to obedience," she said. "But if it breeds rebellion, it damns the soul." She leaned close, her voice dropping to a whisper that slithered into Catherine's ear. "Do not mistake endurance for freedom. None leaves St. Mary's. None." The 2 senior nuns released Catherine. She stumbled, catching herself on the table. Her fingers brushed the ledger's cover. It felt warm, too warm, as if it pulsed faintly beneath her skin. The Mother Superior's pale eyes narrowed. "Return to your bed. Pray for discipline. If I find you here again..." Her smile was sharp as glass. "The ledger will know your silence too." Back in the dormitory, Catherine lay awake, the image of the ledger burning in her mind. She thought of the names, the red ink, Isabel's entry. Was her friend truly alive, or merely a spectre of the past? And how many more had been condemned to silence, their voices stripped, their souls trapped? At dawn, she confided in Margaret. Whispering beneath her breath, Catherine described the ledger and what she had seen. Margaret's eyes widened with terror. "You touched it?" she asked. "Only for a moment." "That's enough," Margaret said, trembling. "The ledger marks you now. Once your name is in that book, you never leave." Catherine swallowed hard. "But I'm not in it. I saw the pages, not yet." Margaret cut her off. "But you will be." The words hung in the air like a curse. Over the next days, Catherine began to notice things she had not before. Whispers at the edge of hearing when she passed certain halls. A faint burning sensation in her fingertips where she had touched the ledger. And most disturbing of all, the way Isabel seemed to appear wherever Catherine went, as if drawn by invisible threads. One evening, while polishing brass in the chapel, Catherine finally asked, "Isabel," she whispered, "how long have you been here?" Isabel's smile faltered. For the first time, her eyes looked tired, ancient even. "Too long," she said softly. "Long enough to know the ledger lies. We are not gone. We are bound." Catherine's chest tightened. "Bound to what?" "To silence," Isabel murmured. "And to her." She glanced toward the altar, where the Mother Superior stood in shadow, her pale eyes gleaming. Catherine shivered. She understood now that the ledger was not merely a record. It was a trap. A prison for souls. And if she could not find a way to destroy it, she too would be written into silence. That night, the bells tolled thrice again. Catherine lay still, her pulse racing. She imagined the nuns descending into the forbidden chamber, the ledger glowing faintly in its candlelit prison, the names within it whispering for release. But another sound reached her ears. Scratching. Soft, deliberate scratching, coming from beneath her bed. Catherine froze. Slowly she bent down. There, tucked against the stone floor, was a scrap of parchment. She pulled it out with shaking hands. It bore a single line, written in familiar, hurried script. "Your name is already written." She read it again and again, her throat closing. Who had written it? How had it been placed beneath her bed? Margaret was asleep, her face turned away, her lips moving in restless dreams. Isabel was nowhere in sight. Catherine clutched the scrap tightly, half wishing she could destroy it, half afraid it might vanish before she found its truth. The next morning, the convent felt different. The silence was heavier than usual, oppressive, pressing against her chest like a weight. She noticed how the walls seemed to absorb every sound, the scrape of spoons in the refectory, the shuffling of feet in the halls, even the sigh of wind outside. It was as if the convent itself hungered for silence, devouring every noise, swallowing it whole. As Catherine knelt in prayer, she thought she heard a whisper behind her. She turned sharply, but the other novices were motionless, heads bowed. Again the whisper came, closer this time, curling against her ear. "Catherine!" Her pulse spiked. She spun around, but no one spoke. No lips moved. The novices remained as statues, their faces blank, their eyes fixed upon the altar. She tried to focus on the prayer, but the voice returned, soft and insistent. "Your name is written. Your silence is near." She clenched her fists to steady herself. She would not give in to fear. But when she looked at the wall behind the altar, her breath caught. The stone's surface rippled, as if water ran beneath it. For a fleeting instant, she saw faces pressing against the stone, dozens of them, mouths sewn shut, eyes wide with agony. Then the wall stilled, blank once more. Catherine almost screamed, but Margaret gripped her hand under the bench, her eyes wide with warning. "Don't," Margaret mouthed silently. "Don't let them know." Later that day, Catherine confided in Isabel while they scrubbed the cloister floors. Isabel listened quietly, her expression unreadable. "You've begun to hear them," Isabel said finally. Catherine swallowed. "Who?" "The others," Isabel replied. "The ones in the walls. Their bodies may be gone, but their voices remain." The convent keeps them. It feeds on them. Catherine shivered. That's impossible. Walls cannot keep souls. Isabel's smile was sad. And yet you heard them. She leaned closer. The ledger binds their names. The walls hold their voices. That is how St. Mary's ensures silence. It buries you twice. First your body. Then your words. Catherine shook her head, refusing to believe it. But as she scrubbed the stone, she felt it again, a vibration beneath her hands, faint but undeniable, like the beating of a heart deep in the earth. The convent was alive. That night sleep offered no refuge. Catherine awoke to the sound of scratching again, not beneath her bed this time, but within the walls themselves. It was slow, deliberate, like fingernails dragging across stone. She held her breath, listening. The scratching grew louder, closer. Then, a whisper seeped through the wall beside her bed. Free us! She bolted upright. Margaret stirred, eyes wide. She had heard it too. Before Catherine could speak, a low groan shuddered through the dormitory. The other girls slept soundly, oblivious, but Catherine and Margaret sat frozen. The wall opposite them bulged outward slightly, as though something pressed against it from the other side. For an instant, cracks spidered across the surface, and a pale hand pushed through. Margaret stifled a scream. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. The hand groped blindly, its fingers bloody, its nails worn to the quick. Then, just as suddenly, it withdrew. The wall sealed shut, smooth and silent. Margaret whispered hoarsely, "It wants out." The next day, Catherine's world tilted further into madness. During chores in the library, she pulled a book from the shelf only to find the pages filled not with scripture, but with names, the same names she had seen in the ledger. Her hands shook as she flipped through. The ink bled as she touched it, smearing across her fingers like fresh blood. A soft chuckle echoed between the shelves. Catherine spun around, heart racing. Mother Superior stood in the doorway. "Curiosity again," she said softly, her voice almost kind. "You must learn, child, that knowledge is a curse when unearned." Catherine tried to speak, but no sound left her throat. It was as though the walls themselves swallowed her words. The Mother Superior approached, her pale eyes locking onto Catherine's. "The whispers frighten you. They always do at first. But soon you will understand. Silence is not absence. It is presence. It is eternal." She reached out, brushing Catherine's cheek with a cold hand. "And you will be eternal, too." Catherine staggered back, clutching the bloody book, but when she looked down, its pages were blank. The names were gone. Had she imagined it? Or had the convent erased her discovery before her very eyes? That night, the whispers grew louder. They no longer spoke only her name. They pleaded, begged, wept. "Cut the thread, burn the book, free us." Catherine pressed her hands over her ears, but the voices pressed deeper, resonating inside her skull. She could feel their pain, their desperation, as if the walls themselves tried to climb into her body. Margaret sat beside her, whispering through clenched teeth. "Don't answer them. If you answer, they'll take you." "But they want freedom," Catherine whispered back. "And so do we," Margaret snapped. "But the convent doesn't allow it. Not for them. Not for us." At that moment, a thunderous crack echoed through the dormitory. The girls bolted upright, some screaming. A fissure tore down the wall, spilling dust and stone. For an instant, Catherine saw dozens of eyes staring out from the crack, wet and glistening, before it sealed itself again. The room fell silent, except for the tolling of the bells. Once. Twice. Thrice. Margaret turned to Catherine, her face pale as death. "They're calling you now," she whispered. "You've heard the walls. You're marked. They won't stop until you follow." Catherine lay back, trembling, the words echoing in her mind. The ledger had her name. The walls had her voice. And now, the convent wanted her silence forever. She knew then that she had two choices: obey and become another whisper in the walls, or rebel, and face whatever horrors the forbidden chamber still held. Midnight at St. Mary's was unlike any hour of the day. During the sunlight, however dim and filtered it might be through the thick glass of the convent windows, there was at least a sense of reality. Hard wood underfoot, stone walls cool to the touch, the faint smell of burning candles and wax. But once the bells tolled 12, the convent seemed to slip into another world, one not entirely of flesh and bone. Catherine, having grown bolder in her observations, began to notice that the nuns moved differently after dark. Their steps were synchronized, their breaths aligned, as though they were part of a single organism that awoke only when the rest of the world slept. She discovered this first by accident. One night she woke to the faint echo of chanting. The sound rolled like a wave through the halls, low and deep, nothing like the familiar hymns of the day. She rose quietly from her cot, pressing her bare feet against the cold stone floor, and followed the sound. Other novices stirred in their beds, but none dared to move. It was as though they had been trained, perhaps unconsciously, not to leave their places after dark. Catherine alone seemed unable to resist. The chapel glowed faintly with candlelight when she arrived, peering through the crack in the door. The nuns had gathered in a circle, their faces veiled in shadows, their hands raised in gestures that looked more like incantations than prayers. At the center of the circle lay a long wooden table, draped with black cloth. On it were the photographs, those chilling memento mori images Catherine had found before. Each photograph was placed carefully, like offerings on an altar. The chants grew louder, rhythmic, punctuated by moments where all voices fell silent, and only the echo of a single leader carried the ritual forward. The words were unfamiliar, not Latin, not any tongue Catherine recognized, but they vibrated through her chest as though the very stones of the convent absorbed and released them. Her eyes locked onto the photographs. Some of them she had seen before, the painted eyes, the faces frozen in deathly stillness. But tonight something shifted. One photograph seemed to tremble, ever so slightly, as though it were breathing. Another shimmered in the candlelight, the lips curving upward in the faintest of smiles. Catherine's breath caught in her throat. Were the dead responding? Suddenly, the Mother Superior raised her hands, and the others fell silent. She spoke clearly now, in a language Catherine could not understand, and the candles flickered violently. The air thickened, heavy with the smell of wax and iron. Catherine felt a pressure in her skull, as if the very sound of the ritual was pushing against her mind. And then the silence came. An unbearable, crushing silence. The kind that was not mere absence of sound, but an active force pressing down, smothering every thought. Catherine felt her own heartbeat grow louder, desperate, as though it too might be silenced if she remained. She clutched the doorframe, fighting the urge to scream. The ritual ended as suddenly as it began. The photographs were gathered, placed carefully back into a locked chest. The nuns dispersed without a word, moving like shadows down the corridors, each step echoing unnaturally loud in Catherine's ears. She barely managed to return to her bed before one of the elder sisters passed by her dormitory, scanning the room with hawk-like precision. Lying under her thin blanket, Catherine's body trembled. Her discovery confirmed her worst fears. The disappearances were not isolated tragedies, nor punishments gone too far. They were part of something deliberate, something ritualistic. The convent did not simply bury its dead. It kept them, bound their essence into photographs, and used them in ceremonies whose purposes Catherine dared not yet imagine. Sleep was impossible that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the painted faces. She saw lips twitching, eyes shifting, the dead refusing to stay still. Worst of all, she felt that silence, the kind that wasn't absence, but presence, creeping back into her skull, whispering without words that she, too, would one day lie on that altar. The silence of St. Mary's grew heavier after the night of the ritual. Catherine moved through the halls with a heightened awareness, watching every shadow, every flicker of candlelight. The faces of her fellow novices seemed pale with fear, though none spoke of what they had seen or heard. A dreadful anticipation hung in the air, like the stillness before a storm. It was Isabel who vanished first. She had been Catherine's closest companion, a girl with gentle eyes and a nervous laugh that brought a rare warmth to the convent's cold walls. One morning, Catherine awoke to find Isabel's bed neatly made, her rosary draped carefully over the pillow. But Isabel herself was gone. No one mentioned her absence at breakfast. Not the elders, not the other novices, no one. It was as if she had never existed. Catherine's blood ran cold. She remembered the way Isabel had clutched her hand during prayer the previous night, trembling as if she, too, had heard the unnatural chants that seeped through the stone. Isabel had whispered, "Something's coming for us." Now, she had been swallowed by that very silence. Later that evening, Catherine found herself drawn to the chapel again. Against her better judgment, she pressed her ear to the heavy wooden doors. From within came the faint scrape of movement, followed by the muffled sound of weeping, or perhaps laughter, it was impossible to tell. When the doors creaked open slightly, she glimpsed the altar. There it was. A new photograph rested in the center, framed by candles. Catherine's stomach lurched as she recognized the face. Isabel. Her eyes had been painted open, but Catherine knew the life had already been drained from them. The once gentle smile was twisted unnaturally, a grotesque parody of her living expression. Her knees threatened to buckle. The truth was undeniable. Isabel had not simply disappeared. She had been taken, absorbed into the convent's unholy ritual, preserved forever in a grotesque form of devotion. That night, Catherine lay awake, clutching her blanket to her chest. The knowledge pressed down on her like the weight of the convent walls. She was not merely training to become a servant of God, she was being groomed as a sacrifice. And if Isabel's photograph had appeared so quickly, Catherine knew it was only a matter of time before her own face joined the collection. The silence of St. Mary's was no longer just unsettling. It was a predator, circling its prey. The fear of Isabel's fate gnawed at Catherine with every passing hour. The convent's air, once merely oppressive, now seemed suffocating. Each prayer session, each silent meal, each step along the stone corridors felt like a countdown. She knew she had little time before her own name was erased from the world and replaced by a painted photograph. Driven by desperation, she began to search in secret. When the others slept, she crept through the halls with a candle stub hidden under her cloak. Her heart hammered in her chest, every creak of the floorboards threatening to betray her. Still, she pressed on, determined to uncover the truth. Her search led her to the convent's library, a place forbidden to novices after dusk. Dust clung to the shelves, and the air reeked of parchment and mildew. By chance, she noticed a seam in the paneling behind one of the heavy oak cases. Pressing against it, she discovered a hidden compartment. Inside was a leather-bound ledger, its cover cracked with age. Catherine carried it back to her chamber and opened it with trembling hands. The first page chilled her blood. It contained a list of names, each one a nun or novice who had once belonged to St. Mary's. Dates were written beside them, spanning decades, even centuries. And next to each name was a small inked symbol, a circle, within which was drawn a single eye. Flipping through the pages, Catherine felt her stomach twist. Isabel's name was there, freshly written in the same ink. Her date of disappearance was marked the very night she had vanished. But the horror deepened when Catherine reached the final pages. There, written neatly, as if waiting its turn, was her own name. Catherine Hale. The ink was still faint, as though it had been written in anticipation. A blank space sat beside it, reserved for a date that had not yet arrived. Her candlelight flickered, casting shadows over the page. She ran her fingers over her name, trying to convince herself this was some mistake, a cruel trick. But deep down she knew, it was a prophecy, a record of sacrifices already determined. The realization hit her like a blow. St. Mary's was no convent of devotion. It was a prison of ritual, a sanctum of horrors where every novice was fated to be consumed, their essence trapped in photographs, their silence eternal. The weight of the discovery left Catherine trembling. She wanted to scream, but she remembered Isabel's whispered words. "Something's coming for us." If she screamed, it would come faster. She closed the ledger with shaking hands, tucking it beneath her blanket. Sleep was impossible, but she forced herself to remain still, her mind racing. Now she knew the truth, but knowledge alone would not save her. If she stayed, the convent would claim her. If she fled, she would have to face the silence that pursued her beyond its walls. Either way, the ledger had sealed her fate. The night Catherine decided to flee, the air itself seemed to resist her. The bells had just tolled midnight when she slipped from her cot, clutching the hidden ledger to her chest as though it were proof of her existence. Each step down the hall felt perilous, her heart beat louder than the creak of the floorboards. She whispered a silent prayer, not for salvation, but for strength. At the far end of the corridor, she met Anna, another novice whose eyes had long betrayed the same fear Catherine carried. Anna had also noticed Isabel's absence, the photographs, the midnight rituals. Without words, the two exchanged a look that bound them together in their desperate resolve. Tonight, they would either leave or be claimed. The convent seemed alive as they moved. Shadows shifted unnaturally, stretching across the walls to block their path. The silence pressed closer, curling around them like an unseen hand. From the chapel came a faint hum, the beginning of another ritual. Catherine shuddered. She knew if they waited even a moment longer, their names would be sealed in ink, their faces painted into the photographs. They reached the heavy wooden gates. Locked, of course. Catherine pulled a stolen iron key from her sleeve, taken from the Mother Superior's study the night before. Her hands shook as she fitted into the lock. Behind them, the hum grew louder, more voices joining the chant. The sound seemed to crawl up the walls and seep into their bones. The key turned. The gate creaked open. A rush of cold night air swept over them, sharp with the scent of pine and damp earth. For a brief moment, Catherine felt a surge of hope. Freedom was just beyond the threshold. But the convent did not release its prey so easily. The bells erupted into a furious toll, their clangs echoing like 1,000 screams. The ground seemed to tremble beneath their feet, and the chanting behind them rose to a fever pitch. Catherine glanced back just once, and saw figures in black habits emerging from the shadows, their faces blank, their eyes glinting unnaturally in the moonlight. "Run!" Anna gasped, pulling her forward. They stumbled across the threshold, the gates slamming behind them with a force that rattled the earth. The chanting ceased. For a moment, there was only the sound of their labored breathing and the rustle of leaves in the night wind. Catherine dared to believe they had escaped. But as she looked back at the convent, its looming silhouette against the moonlit sky, she felt the weight of silence pressing still upon her chest. The gates might have closed, but the presence lingered, as though the convent had extended itself into the world beyond its walls. The ledger in her arms seemed heavier now, the ink inside whispering of names yet to be written. Catherine realized the truth with chilling clarity: escape was only the beginning. St. Mary's would not let them go so easily. The silence was coming with them. Ch2.